Welcome to the Maxark podcast, where we awaken together and share our greatest gift with the world. My guest today is Greg Kelly. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks for having me here today.
So, Greg, you are an expert in, I would say, supplements, the brain, nutrition. Can you give us a brief overview before we start talking about meditation, calm, and focus, and what like ingredients and vitamins are interesting? Give us like a little overview, like where you're coming from and where all that knowledge and wisdom comes from.
Yeah, so before jumping into that, I'm a big fan of Tim Urban, some of his mental models, and he's got one that kind of is his drawing of the Dunning-Kruger type thing, but the general idea was the original paper was unskilled and unaware of it. So he has what he calls the child hill. So this is respect to knowledge. And when child hill is usually when we're beginning on something and, we think, oh, we got this, we know a lot. And if eventually, ideally you slide into, I think what he calls the valley of ignorance, right? Where like you've learned enough to know like, oh my God, I don't know how I thought I knew so much before. And from there, if you stick with something, you'll usually start to climb the hill of true knowledge. So I think of myself as somewhere no longer in the valley of ignorance, well off the child hill, but there's always more to learn as you're like climbing that hill of knowledge. So how I got personally on that hill of knowledge is I'm a naturopathic doctor, graduated in 96, initially worked for a company named Thorne right out of school and before I went into practice, so used a lot of supplements, right? So they were part of my toolbox and, other things were as well, and have done over the years, other supplement things, working with people, doing a corporate wellness gig for about 7 years. And, more recently over the last 6 years, working for Neurohacker Collective, which is known for the Qualia brand of products. And we started at Neurohacker as a cognitive brand. So we had Qualia Mind as a nootropic stack, but because of our branding, Neurohacker, because Qualia Mind was a nootropic, we're just always been a very brain focused company. And so, and it's my role as the VP of product development. I just spend a lot of my time studying neuroscience, interviewing neuroscientists, reading the latest things, and then spend a fair amount of time looking at supplement research on the brain. So and the vast majority of things I see pitched by influencers or things, it's like, LOL, I read this studies, this didn't really do anything, right? So, which is understandable, right? Like it's people that are on Tim Urban's child hill, trying to make sense of things. And, but that said, there's also some things that can really be useful. So, the plan today with you, Max, is that we'll get into a few of those for helping listeners with something, that generically we'll call focus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, as I've told you, the podcast is a lot about awakening. And from my perspective, meditation is a very important, let's say, skill to master on that progression or that path towards awakened awareness, awakening. And you said like focus is what you would call from a brain science perspective really important for meditation. So please explain what is focus from like your neuroscience, brain science perspective? What does it even mean, focus?
Yeah, so when neuroscientists often will talk of either like cognitive domains would be the big picture. If you looked in, in the US, what's called the DSM-4, right? Like that's how do you categorize challenges with brains, right? And they're usually grouped into things like, as an example, think of social cognition. So social cognition is your empathy and something called theory of mind, like being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, so to speak. But then you have, learning and memory, you have language, you have executive functions, you have visual spatial, so think of like, an athlete, hand-eye coordination. And then you have what's thought of as attention. So focus is merely the lay word for what neuroscientists call attention. And for these various cognitive domains, there's skills within them. So executive function, as an example, has working memory and cognitive flexibility and others. And within the attention one, there's that as well, right? There's, what they would think of as alertness. There's what would be thought of as, divided attention and selective attention in these various flavors of attention. And then there's, fundamentally, okay, like I was distracted, like now dragging my attention back, right? So that starts to get into that executive function area. And what neuroscientists would now describe is that, there's no one brain area that's in charge of attention. There's attentional networks, and there's more than one interacting. So when you're in a state like meditation, what's happening is those networks, and for the listeners, a network, if they were imaging a brain, what they would see is different parts of the brain lighting up with more activity, all almost linked together, right? When you're doing something.
Can I ask a question there?
Yeah.
How do you measure the activities in the brain?
So the most common way, they're measuring fundamentally blood flow. So when you're seeing, whether it's an EEG or an MRI, what's typically, think of it as they're measuring the metabolic activity. And the clue to that is increased blood flow, like bringing resources in, primarily glucose and other things that can be used for energy, and removing waste. So that's what they measure, right? Is that blood flow and metabolic rate in that part of the brain. And that's a clue that, okay, this part is much more active. And what they'll see is a whole network of things will light up together in an individual when they're doing something that is more demanding on their attentional network, and focus, or like meditation would be. But in general, almost any time we're using that word focus, just think, oh, like it's the attentional networks, all of these, brain areas working together that are being asked to do a lot more than we're in a, what I would think of as a more zoned out state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to add in there maybe like a more clarification why I think that attention is focused, or where I see the parallels to my own path of awakening and meditation. And I think a lot of meditations that you see, especially also in Buddhism and Mahamudra, we have this mindfulness practice where we focus our attention. There's also the elephant path, and we say, okay, there's this wild, crazy elephant as a metaphor for our normal, crazy mind. And we want to tie the rope of mindfulness to this elephant to watch it, or to watch an object, like watching our breath or watching whatever the meditation object is. And for this, I think that's where I see, okay, attention is important, and the focus on like one object. And I remember 10 years ago, or 12 years ago, when I just started meditation, that, yeah, it was challenging to just get started with that and just really just focus on the breath or focus on the object that I was looking at. And I think it's still a huge challenge when I talk to people and ask like, okay, why don't you have a meditation practice or a daily practice? They often say like they cannot focus on one thing. They have like so many thoughts going on.
Yeah, and that would be common, like even, so just think academically, right? Not a meditator, but it would be somewhat similar. Like you're sitting in a lecture hall, someone's going to speak for the next 50 minutes. What would naturally happen with our attention, our ability to focus, is it's going to ebb and flow over those 50 minutes. So usually the beginning and the end will be much more attentive, right? We'll, be focused on that. But during the, say the 45 minutes in between the beginning of end, it will be almost like up and down, right? There'll be things that we zoned out to, other things that attention popped up. And I think attention is a lot like a muscle, right? That we can do things to train it so that we can stay focused more of that, say, 50-minute time period. Some people are, maybe more naturally gifted to stay focused. Others are more distractible. But it's, to me, one of the things that meditation is doing is it's building that focus muscle over time, right? Every time you're aware that attention has drifted, right? We become distracted. You're exerting cognitive control to drag it back and say, no, pay attention to this, whether that's breathing.
I love that workout analogy. It's really the perfect analogy, yeah.
and what I you and I were talking about it before recording, is that meditation in a way can be a distracting word. There's many varieties of it, but people may say they're meditating, and we physiologically may look at them, and what their brain and body are doing doesn't look remotely like someone maybe like yours that's very skilled and practiced in meditation. So
because the word is used by so many different people in so many different ways, right? Like some people think they are listening to something, having a trance, a visualization, and that is a meditation. Some people do the mindfulness meditation. Some people do, let's say, just focus on non-duality, on awakened awareness. There are just so many, I think, like associations, like what is meditation even?
Yeah, the way I would think about it personally would be like the term exercise, right? Exercise is a big category of things that can be vastly different from each other, right? Like what a bodybuilder is doing when they're what they call exercise would be very different than a sprinter, would be very different than maybe a skier, right, as an example. And what someone that's really good in their sport is doing when they're doing their exercise may be very different than someone that's just getting started or isn't improving, right? And what the commonality would be is people that are really good in their sport are hyper-focused on it when they're doing. People that are new to it often are more what would be thought of as zoned out. Like their brain, they're engaged in exercise, but their brain isn't focused in the same way. And I think that's the...
How do you measure this? You used the word before, this zoned out. Can you explain more? What do you mean by that and how do you measure it?
Yeah, so the way I would think of it, and this has been very well studied for expert meditators, but when they're in the midst of what they're describing as meditation, for them, what you would normally see is a big increase in amplitude. And amplitude, think of a wave, like from the bottom to the top is the amplitude. So their alpha brain waves, as an example, is going to be a much bigger wave. Someone that would be more zoning out would be like, like a flatter sea, so to speak, or flatter ocean, right? They don't have that big activity in that. Heart rate variability is another thing that, many people use to measure stress, but, variability is in that, right? And what heart rate variability is the beat to beat difference of your heart rate. And if you were to map all that out, what you would see, again, especially if you get into a state where your breathing is resonant. So, like a 5 second in, 5 second out, as an example, not the only way to do it. What you'll see is your nervous system gets more into like what looks like a repeating wave state on HRV, and a bigger wave there is generally a healthier person. Like what they're doing is meditative, right? Like they may be focusing on that repetitive breathing. But when I say zoned out, what I'm saying is that, like whether it's heart rate variability or, like high amplitude brain waves, we're not seeing that in that person. What we're seeing them would be states that would be more like, think of taking a nap or lying quietly doing nothing, like the opposite of working out. So, I think...
I was just thinking of, for example, in a yoga class, that is something that really confused me since my own awakening, is that usually at the end of a yoga class, we do the shavasana, like the dead or the corpse pose, where you just lie with closed eyes. And I would have this too, like earlier in my life, that I would just zone out in trance and kind of fall asleep for like a short nap. And then the teacher says, okay, come back to your bodies, come back to the room. And it really felt like this before awakening. But now I'm wondering, I'm just staying aware of body, of the room, of everything. And now I'm wondering, what do you mean by come back to your body? Like, come back to what? Like, I didn't go anywhere because I stay aware.
Yeah, so that would be an example of where I would say you were staying focused on what was going on in your body, but most of the people that went away somewhere, they zoned out, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's just not the same as meditation. And
it's a difference, yeah.
Yeah, and there's benefits to both, right? Like, and naturally, as I mentioned, we'll ebb and flow. Our brain doesn't like, just like it wouldn't like, lifting the same weight repeatedly for an hour, it's a lot of work to stay focused on our meditation practice for a duration of time, right? So our it's why someone like you that's invested 10 years, I'm sure if we measured your brain and physiology, we would see a lot different state than someone that's, maybe doing the same practice, but is a month into it, as an example.
I would be open to measure that. I find it very interesting. So if you ever do a study and need a participant, let me know.
Yeah, it's not, our thing at Neurohacker, but there's, that's, like I mentioned, it's been an area that's been, I think, looked at, since, I remember reading about studies in it in the 90s. So it's been, quite a long time that they've looked at, expert meditators to see what's really going on with them. And I know we mentioned this before. If we were to measure heart rate variability in the midst of meditation for expert meditators, it looks like, their physiology is more stressed during that. They're not feeling stressed. They're probably, their brain, their journey is feeling contemplative and relaxed, but they're working hard to be in that state. And not to belabor it, but many people that think they're meditating aren't. They're doing the equivalent of, what some people do at the gym. They're on the stationary bike reading the newspaper. Like, all right, you're exercising, but you're not focused on the exercise. You're distracted, right? And almost invariably, that idea of pay attention exists in a lot of languages, right? Until we pay attention, right? We invest in it. What we get out of that activity is diminished.
Mm-hmm. So could you summarize what is focus? What is attention?
So the key thing, so when these attentional networks working together to get us focused, think of it, there's 3 core elements we need. We need alertness. Without alertness, there is nothing past that, right? We are just fooling ourselves. We need to then be able to put our attention on something and keep it there. And then we need to drag it back when it drifts off, which it will naturally do, right? That's what happens. So that would be often thought of as executive control. So to stay focused longer or for more of our day, whether it's meditation, work, exercise, you name it, we need those three parts of the recipe. We need alertness, directing our attention on something and then being able to repeatedly drag it off because it's going to shift away.
Yeah. So let's talk about what is the brain food that we need for that in terms of supplements, vitamins, minerals. What can we take to support our brain in this attention, in this alertness, in this executive function of bringing it back when it gets distracted?
Well, I think by far the most widely used alertness promoting compound on the planet are things with caffeine. So whether that's coffee or yerba mate, green tea, you name it, and there's a reason for that. And this would be a general rule. Like alertness, is tied in with our circadian rhythm. So naturally we have a rhythm of alertness across the day. But it's not like moving in a straight line. So for many people, there's a lull in that alertness system, sometime after lunch in the early afternoon. But alertness, that's, when you think of alertness, think of that feeling of not too much caffeine from those plants, but a just right amount. So maybe a small cup of coffee.
I don't want to be jittery in the body when I meditate.
Right. You just want to make sure you have enough that alertness base is covered. And, often the alertness tank is pretty full if we've slept well at the beginning of the day, which is, I know when I used to practice yoga more routinely, I always did it, fairly close to first thing in my day. And, now I start my day more with what I think of as ceremony music, where, I focus on that music. That's, and then try to experience it in my body. That's really easy at the beginning of my day because the alertness tank is full, even before having something like green tea or coffee for me. But if someone's struggling with alertness, and trying to do their meditation at some other point in the day, then those plants, and again, like more is not better, but, enough, like think maybe a cup of tea, right? There's a reason a lot of Buddhist traditions, tea is integrated into, what they're doing there. So, alertness, that's yours. And then there's other, Alpinia galanga, which is a Southeast Asian root ginger family. There's been some studies on that for enhancing alertness. So that's maybe the best non-caffeine way would be that, or a tea like a ginger tea, right? That's not stimulating in the sense that caffeine would be, but may help to keep the brain a bit more alert during our meditations.
And can you repeat the name?
Yeah, so the plant's name is Alpinia galanga, and galangal is the common name in the U.S. And it's a root that's in that generally thought of as in that ginger family of plants. But the branded one that's been studied in the U.S. is called N extra, ENXTRA. So that's their use case in their studies has always been almost compared to caffeine to see if it also helped with that focus and alertness. And there's been a couple of studies, and it's useful, right? It's not caffeine, it's not stimulating, it's not going to do exactly what caffeine does, but it would be the basis of an iced tea, or as a non-caffeine way to do things. That could be an ingredient to try.
And I guess in general, it's like with any supplement, you got to do your own experiment, like how much you need and at what point of the day it makes the most sense, right?
Yeah. Your mileage may vary is the way the nootropic community always describes it. So that would be another option if someone was reticent to have caffeine. And then, green tea, since we mentioned that, green tea is not just caffeine, right? That's green tea has polyphenols, but it has something called L-theanine, which is, why green tea would often be experienced very differently than a cup of coffee, as an example, because coffee doesn't have that L-theanine component. And what L-theanine seems to do really well is almost complement caffeine to getting our attentional networks more into that alpha brain state, where they can have what's often thought of as more relaxed focus. Where, as you mentioned, caffeine, especially if we take too much, can kind of move us right through that nice sweet spot of being alert to almost, that jittery, irritable, like not an ideal state to do our practices in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had exactly one flat white before this podcast, so that's perfect.
Yeah. I had a small cup of coffee with some heavy whipping cream and honey. That's my jam first thing in my morning, and but not a lot, and that's it. I don't rely on more caffeine to get me through my day. So and if you do, like, no judgment, but I just generally think of most things in having a Goldilocks zone, right? So the Goldilocks story: one bowl was too cold, one was too hot, and one was just right. And for each of us, that just right amount of alertness and what might get us there can be different. So it's important to, experiment and use these to get alertness to the right Goldilocks place, but not do so much that we get to the bowl is too hot zone.
Mm-hmm. So we got coffee, green tea, galangal.
Yeah, yerba mate would be another caffeine containing, but the yerba mate, like all of these plants are going to have polyphenols as well that have some slight benefits, but green tea, because of the L-theanine, is probably the one that's most associated with, for lack of a better word, maybe that tranquility or calm. And you can find L-theanine as a standalone thing to add in. So I know, like Qualia Mind, we've always had caffeine, L-theanine stack in that because we want to create more of that calm focus. Then that state is more productive, whether it's for meditation or for work or other things. So, for listeners, that's, a compound that you can find on the market, L-theanine, and maybe experiment with. And usually, often you'll see a ratio of like 1 to 1 to 2 to 1 L-theanine to caffeine in studies. So, this would be a general rule of thumb, somewhere between 50 to at most 200 milligrams of caffeine is going to put you in that best alertness spot for focus. But if you're 50, maybe then 50 to 100 milligrams of L-theanine becomes what you might stack with it. Or like you had a flat.
So now people are wondering. Right? Like how much caffeine was in my flat white today? How
Yeah,
many
without knowing how
milligrams?
much. Like one thing I remember this story going way back. I had a friend. Lived in Mexico, and I visited him when I was in naturopathic school one vacation, and he's like, "Oh, Greg, what do you think of coffee?" I'm like, "Well, how much coffee are we speaking about here?" And he said, "Oh, I have I don't know, 3 or 4 cups of coffee a day." So, what would be your next question to him, Max?
How big is the cup?
Exactly. So that was my next question.
How do you prepare the coffee? Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's another great question. So I'm like, oh, go get me like your cup. I want to see how big it is. And it looked like what I would view. I mean, it was 32 ounces, so I don't know what that is in milliliters, but like think of closer to a liter of coffee than what I would think of as like my size cup. And it's like, oh, so you're drinking more like for Greg's cups, like 12 or 14 of them a day, something like that. And like that's probably beyond like that sweet spot. So like a flat white, how it was made, the size of the cup would vary. But in general, like, so say a 12-ounce cup, like of Starbucks coffee in the US, like they're tall, it's probably 130 milligrams, roughly,
Yeah.
right? Somewhere in there. You get into the bigger sizes, they're pushing the, over the top or above, right? That sweet spot. So, so just think like I know I go to Spain, Portugal, not every year, but two of my favorite places to go. And the size, at a cafe in Spain where you'd get a cafe con leche, that's probably just under 100 milligrams. And for most people, that's a good alerting amount. And it's, in that culture, what they'll do is they'll, have maybe a couple breaks during the day where they have the small, where in the US it's like, oh, let me go to Starbucks and what's the biggest size that you have available, right? So
Right.
we won't want bigger. We just want enough to get that alertness toggle. And then, if you're doing a good quality matcha green tea, you're probably getting both, like sufficient caffeine and L-theanine.
Right. Because you mentioned also the calming effect of green tea, and yeah, I think calming is what you eventually should get to in the meditation. Because for me, I don't feel like working out in a way, even though like you could measure it in my brain probably. For me internally, it doesn't feel like work. But yeah, I think being calm and present at the same time, like that's a good description of how I feel most of the day. So maybe we could get more into like calmness. What
Yes.
is calm, and what are some things that would also support the calm feeling for people?
Yeah. So when I think of focus, and this would just be like a generality, but that think of like there's almost two camps of people that struggle to get into that focus state that you just mentioned that you can get into. And one, it's almost like their brain is too bored or it doesn't have the motivation, like it's lacking something there. And the other, it's almost like they have racing thoughts. There's too much going on in their mind.
This is most people that I talk to. Why don't you meditate? They always say, I have so many thoughts going on, I can't be calm, can't be still.
Yeah, so it's like, well, just that racing thoughts end. So magnesium would be the first thing that comes to mind. Magnesium's a really important mineral for more that GABA system in the brain, which puts the brakes on it when it's running away. And what would have been true, like, you've lived in some beautiful places in Europe, and like if we went back, say when you were in Switzerland, 100 years, probably most of the local people there, drank all local water, which I'm sure was really mineral rich. Like, so think of like a Gerolsteiner bottled mineral water from Europe, right? Like that's a magnesium rich water. And so historically, we'd have probably got somewhere 15 to 20% of our daily magnesium needs just from drinking great water. Where now, I can't speak to where you live now in the Netherlands, but or where you are recording this. But in the U.S., if I went to like Costco or a natural food market, most of the water, even if it's costs a lot, has been demineralized. Whether that's through reverse osmosis, which gets rid of 97, 98% of minerals, or some other purification method. Even if it's actual mineral water, the range of those minerals can be widely different between like a Gerolsteiner and some other, good quality mineral water.
Yeah, Gerolsteiner. I will say it in German, Gerolsteiner. So it's actually a water, right, from Germany that I heard is pretty popular with like biohackers in the US because it has so many minerals. That's quite funny for me.
Yeah, and it's magnesium rich, so it's about 60 milligrams of magnesium in a serving size. But anyways, like long story short, we would have historically got much more magnesium reliably in what we drink, and we would have got more in our food. But because of mineral depleted soil, food's not as great. So long story short is many people don't get as much magnesium in their diet and water as our ancestors would have got, and as we would need, for our brain to be in its calmest state possible. So we don't have to go crazy and take 500 milligrams of magnesium, but filling that gap can be important, right? Like I was talking to you before, like I tend to use the idea of resources, that our brain needs the right portfolio of resources to perform at its highest level, and magnesium's one of the ones for many people predictably they don't have enough of. And getting even 100, 200 more milligrams can make a big difference, and kind of putting the brake.
I want to dive deeper into magnesium because there are like many different types of magnesium salts, right? Could you explain that a bit more? And is there like a difference, like which types you take?
Yeah, there's some difference. So like if you would think in mineral water, most of it's going to be more magnesium chloride, which gets thrown under the bus sometimes as not a bioavailable, but magnesium chloride is a great magnesium. There's magnesium glycinate and magnesium L-threonate, so that's called magtine. Magnesium aspartate, which used to be widely used in Germany as an example, that's almost not used anymore. So mag citrate, mag malate. So there's all these different salts that you mentioned, and what they do is typically tell a story of bioavailability, like, oh, my magnesium's better because it's more bioavailable. But the two things that are most important for absorbing magnesium are how much your body needs it. So when someone's body needs magnesium, they'll absorb more, no matter what form it's taken in, and the amount of magnesium you take at any one time. And the bigger the amount, the lower the percentage of it you'd absorb, no matter how bioavailable it is. So all of those, salts are better or worse. And some, like there's one called magnesium acetyltaurate, that's sometimes it's logoed as ATA magnesium in the United States. That tends to be a bit more of a calming magnesium. Magnesium glycinate, for many people, they experience as very calming. Magnesium orotate would be another. But in general, most magnesium is going to be somewhat calming because that magnesium part of it, no matter what it was attached to in the supplement or in, food, water, is going to be liberated. And, that magnesium ion will go to where it's needed in our brain or muscles or other tissues and organs. So, someone doesn't have to get, super nerdy about, oh, this is the best magnesium. If you need magnesium, almost any will be useful, and some are just more useful than others, if that makes sense.
What are other interesting ingredients for our brain that would help with meditation?
So another one that, again, I think because our diet routinely doesn't, on average, have enough of it, it would be choline as choline as a compound. And so I think it was, yeah. So choline would be, it's, a methyl donor amino acid like compound. That's eggs is the best dietary source, and specifically the yolk of eggs. And because going way back in the U.S., many doctors said don't eat egg yolks because bad equals cholesterol. Egg yolks have a lot more things in them, including being a great source of choline. So long story short, it's a thing like magnesium that many people don't get quite enough in the diet. So that doesn't mean they're deficient, but they for sure have less than the optimal amount. And choline plays a super important role in making acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter in your brain that has a lot to do with neuroplasticity. So when you think of, learning, memory, which getting better at meditation, right, needs both of those things, or focus, acetylcholine's involved in all of those. And, what you would normally see, in the nootropic forms of choline are things like alpha GPC and acetylcholine. But, most choline, even the less, great ones, can still support that choline pool. And so, my general notion is that just based on average, unless someone's eating, eggs fairly frequently as part of their diet, their brain would usually do better with another 100 milligrams or so of choline in their diet, just to kind of make sure that the tanks are topped off. And without it, it's just hard for the brain to run the attentional networks we spoke about. And it's really hard for the brain to improve. So the analogy or the story, sometimes you've probably heard of the idea of 10,000 hours,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the
Do
general
you want
idea
to
is,
quickly explain it for people who haven't heard it?
yeah. So this, so the idea is like it takes 10,000 hours to master something, chess, meditation maybe. And that's an average, right? Like people that are exceptional, maybe some of them got there in 2000 and some took, 15,000. But it takes, a certain amount of time invested in something to become a master at it for most of us. And then the key thing is that we actually have to be focused in those hours, right? Otherwise, if we're zoned out for 10,000, like I've played a lot of chess during lockdown here on my iPad. I'm still not very good at chess because I wasn't focusing on it, right? I was distracting myself playing it, right? So, but the key thing I want to impress on the listeners is that without acetylcholine, those 10,000 hours would be wasted, right? So it's putting the time in, being focused when we're doing it, and then having the resources so that the brain can reshape itself, right? And acetylcholine plays a disproportionate role in that reshaping neuroplasticity part of the brain. So, when the listeners are investing in getting better at meditation, we want them to be focused and we want their brain to have the resources to reshape itself to become more and more expert at meditating, which your brain has because you've been doing things with these nootropic forms of choline for many years.
Yeah. I think I mentioned that like in my older videos and content when I spoke about the Qualia Mind supplement. I definitely could sense that when I use that regularly, that my meditations would be easier. It would be like easier to drop into this calm sense of this awareness, this wide ocean where it's just calm, soft focus. And yeah, it definitely noticed the difference while taking Qualia Mind versus not taking it.
Yeah. And then the other thing, just I think that is super important to realize about the brain is that everything we're asking the brain to do requires energy, like literally everything, right? And when we're asking it to do more, which we would be if, getting back to your analogy about the elephant and, pulling back to where, right, where it may not feel like it, but we're asking parts of our brain to do more during our meditations. And more means we need more energy, more resources. And so, energy for the brain primarily is glucose. Ketones would be kind of a backup thing. And, we can shift the metabolism of the brain by going keto as an example and, force it to burn more
I
keto.
just wanted to jump in there and ask you, So because you mentioned glucose as like the needed for the energy in the brain, but I want to ask, when I'm doing a ketogenic diet, which is like eating mostly fats and some protein and very little carbs, which I did for 1 year, I just transitioned out of it. How is that different?
Yeah, so you're what's happening there is you're still maintaining blood sugar amounts when you're in ketone, right? Like your brain's converting amino acids and other things to provide that to keep the basal amounts available for the brain. So even if you're in keto, you're probably still getting the disproportionate of energy of what your brain is running on is still glucose, even though you're not getting any in your diet to speak
Because
of.
my body is converting the ketones into glucose for
Not
the brain,
ketones,
or
but
why?
but amino acids primarily is what it's going to turn into glucose. But because of that, like people will
Okay.
be on like in ketosis, but their blood sugar will still not be crazy low, right? It'll be in a normal range, and that's because we need to keep blood sugar in that normal range because even in ketosis, our brain is still demanding some glucose to run the energetic needs. It's just
Said
using
it will, yeah, you said it will take amino acids then?
yeah, some amino acids are it's work, metabolic work to turn them into glucose, but yeah, that's something that our system can do. So, it's metabolic flexibility would be the general idea, right? Like that there's metabolic flexibility built into the system because evolutionarily that was important to survive, right?
Please explain the term metabolic flexibility.
So it's just being able to shift to burn different sources of fuel, right? So, carbs are going to be glucose will be an output of that. Ketones for someone on a heavy fat low carb diet, right? They'll make ketones as a fuel supply. Amino acids, some are able to be put into the producing sugar. So there's just this flexibility built into our system, and then different people, maybe genetically, maybe for other reasons, are more efficient at burning, you different forms of food as fuel. And what you generally would see, if you took a healthy 25-year-old young adult, their brain's going to be pretty efficient at burning anything that gives glucose, like any good quality source, right? Like think sweet potatoes or yams or honey, things like that. If you have a fairly challenged older brain, someone struggling with memory or a brain related thing with aging, they're usually energetically, their brain's not so good at converting that to fuel and do better when there's more ketones in the diet. So,
Mm.
someone like you, your brain's probably got the metabolic flexibility to do well, whether it's keto, whether it's, a more good quality carb based diet. But that everyone's not like that. Some people, and usually the more challenged someone's brain is with, mood issues or, even more serious psychological disorders or age-related things, they tend to benefit much more from, having more things that can be made to produce higher ketones in the blood because their brain seems to do better running on those. So for listeners, it just depends. Like if you're if you feel like it's worth running the experiment, some people will for sure feel like their brain is running much cleaner when they get more ketones produced from their
Yeah,
diet.
so I started my ketogenic diet, when was it, like December 2022? And I was pretty much in ketosis for 1 year straight. And I would definitely notice like a effect on my brain. And especially also when I combined it with intermittent fasting. So now we're actually talking about like some other interesting things like diet and fasting and how this affects focus and calm and memory and meditation probably. But I really noticed that on the ketogenic diet, especially combined with intermittent fasting, so eating only 2 meals a day, I would like naturally feel more focused.
Yeah, and it's what can happen for many people, when they first go keto, the first few days, it feels like their brain's struggling to perform often, right? Like almost sometimes you'll hear like keto flu or like very
Yeah.
brain foggy, right? Like they don't have the metabolic flexibility to shift gears quickly, so it takes time for their metabolism to get on board with that. And it's why, you know, some of the people I would think of as the long-term biohackers, like a Dave Asprey, you know, they don't do typically anymore like a year-long keto. They'll do things to, like, you know, go in and out of keto more aggressively at different points of the day through intermittent fasting, or have maybe a window in the winter where they go more keto for those couple months, and to just to make sure they're you know, exercising that metabolic flexibility muscle, so to speak. But, you know, I think, again, the main thing for the audience to remember is you're asking your brain to do more, whether that's meditation or some other area in your life. You're requiring it now to use more energy, and to, you know, have more energy, we need more resources and things that help it run the brain energy, like fundamentally burn fuel. And, you know, those can be things like, you know, CoQ10 and PQQ and these other mitochondrial nutrients that can help. So, you know, I just generally think in terms of when, you know, I'm asking my brain to do more or putting, you know, more demands on myself, neuroscientists would say, okay, the cognitive load has gone up. And to be able to meet that new cognitive load, those demands, our brain needs more resources. And, you know, resources may come from the diet, they may come from supplements, but, you know, breathing exercises, you know, making sure like our breathing's better will give, you know, more oxygen, like that system will be improved. But like bottom line is, you know, we're requesting it do more. We need to make sure we're doing our part and giving it more and better resources.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a wonderful summary for the end of this short episode. Or do you think there's like anything more important to add here right now?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of things. So, you know, just wrapping up, you know, when we're thinking of focus, just think of the magic recipe is, you know, we need alertness, we need, you know, things to support that attentional network, and then we need that cognitive control. So that idea of like, okay, we're going to drag ourselves back from these, you know, thoughts now that are causing my mind to race. And that in those brain tasks take energy, they take resources. And so if you're struggling with any of those things, you know, some of the, you know, ingredients or foods that Max and I mentioned today could be things worth experimenting with.
Hey guys, I really hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you feel interested in optimizing your brain, but you don't want to buy 20 different supplements, I highly recommend Qualia Mind. Qualia Mind is a so-called nootropic stack, and it includes 28 active ingredients, minerals, vitamins, plant extracts that have all been researched to help and improve brain function, brain health, memory, focus, attention. Yeah, so if you really want to optimize your brain, Qualia Mind has all of this in just one capsule. And I've been using Qualia Mind for many years now. I still really enjoy it, and I must say, really the days where I took Qualia Mind in the beginning, I really felt how it helped with deepening my meditation, how it helped me to be more calm and present, and how it also helped me in conversations with people to connect better with them. And overall, it's also a huge boost in productivity and getting things done. So if you want to try out Qualia Mind, go to qualialife.com/MHP, and you'll get a special discount, 15% discount on Qualia Mind. If you get a subscription at the moment, you can try this out for just $39 actually. And if you're from Europe, check out the link to the European shop in the description of this video. Until next time, sending you much love.